Okay, it is exactly 8:30 p.m. and we now have uh, switched our time to daylight saving time here in the Central Time Zone. So we're going to get started with week six already, and what that means is that after today's week, you will have weeks 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. That means we'll have five more. So kind of we're at the midway point as we finish this week. So make sure that you do read and notice the things that I send you. I got something that I ran across today. Our librarian sent us, and I'm going to try to include that not in our session today, but I'm going to try to email each of you, and I'm going to also try to post it in the classroom. So I think you'll benefit from it. So let's go ahead and just get started. Okay. So here we go. Um, Again, you have your rubrics there. And if you have trouble viewing these rubrics that are on here, just make sure that you check the rubrics that I emailed to you, because I tried to put them on here, and some of them could not be retrieved. So want to make sure that you get those. So make sure you go back and you look at the things that I emailed you at the beginning of the quarter and use those rubrics each week. I encourage you to please use your rubrics for your written assignments, which this week you'll discover you have a written assignment and you don't have a course project until week 8. And during week 8, you will have a course project and written assignment. But for the next few weeks, 6 and 7, you will have a written assignment and then your discussion posts. So again, I'm addressing the fact that I've been advised that when you copy and paste these links that are on here, they're not working, and I've been trying to figure out how to get them on here exactly so that I can get you the exact document on the course homepage. But I have been able to include that in your written assignments. I mean, in your email at the very beginning of the quarter. So make sure that you can go back and take a look at that. All right. So now I'm reminding you that we have 2 more sessions after today, week 8 and week 10. Week 8 is 2 weeks from today, and then week 10 is 2 weeks after that. So also, if you recordings for week 2, week 4, and initial, you can copy and paste these links if you don't have them, because I did email them to you so you can look at them. Again, very important that you make sure you either attend the live recordings or either you make sure that you do listen to the recording itself. And we're going to go only until 10. At 10, I'm going to cut off wherever I am. So let's start out with the 6th week. We're going to deal with crimes involving public health and safety. We're going to talk about how the law applies in terms of protecting the public and what has taken place to prepare for this, chapters 11 and 12 of the textbook. I also emailed you copies of those PowerPoints and the additional information to assist you in your writing and preparation for your written assignments. And then there's an activity, offenses against public order and health, which I go over very briefly, but you can take the time to go over them on your own time. I do recommend check them out because they provide information to help you when you get to the quiz, and also helps you to understand some of the concepts and principles in the module that we include and in the PowerPoints and with the lectures. Discussion post involves the U.S. Patriot Act. Your initial post due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, and then your reply post, of course, is due Saturday by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. A student sent me a message, and I don't know if it was in this class, but I'm going to mention in all the lectures that they thought that the initial post was due on Wednesday. I said not for a long, several quarters back we changed it. I think it was 2 quarters back that they changed it to Tuesday nights, 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you submit it on Wednesday, you will lose 1 point, and then you've been seeing my comments. I'll let you know if you have a good post, and if you're doing a good post, then just keep doing that in future posts. And then I tell you what I like especially. I love to see in the posts references, and they're not required, but I let you know I like them, and then I encourage you to post additional posts. And I do remind students of the deadline for actually the ending of the post is really Saturday night by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. However, I generally extend it to Sunday because that's when all your written assignments are due. So that means that if you submit a post on Sunday, then it's going to be late and you're going to lose a point, but it'll still be counted. If you submit it after Sunday rather, you're not going to get any points for that post because of the rule that I went over early, indicating that at the end of the discussion forum, no points will be awarded. Finally, your written assignment is criminal liability for corporate officers. That's a 2-page written assignment. I will say it again, citations and references are required to satisfy APA, along with make sure you put a cover sheet in there as well. Make sure, and most of you are pretty good about that. What I'm about to say is running your papers through Grammarly. Grammarly is the tool that we use to check to see how much critical thinking that you're doing, and I've already said a lot. I again ran across a resource that was posted, and I'm going to send it to you to help you with a little better understanding of critical thinking, and it's going to be very beneficial. It's a really, really good article. I have about 3 articles I'm going to send you that will help you with your APA, your writing, and other things as well that I had a chance to be exposed to today. So anyway, in all written assignments, including your project, but now we're talking about the fact that you have just written assignments for week 6, 7, excuse me, and you will take those assignments and make sure you have those APA requirements met and run your papers through Grammarly. And then reminding you about my motto, adversity is a springboard to success. You know what that's about from week 1's open house. And then I remind you that we are going to finish strong. That's what we want you to do. So as I said earlier, we're going to the second half. And so let's take a look at our calendar here. Okay, let's pull it up. Okay, so this is where we are this week. In week 6, you have your reading assignment, you have your initial post, you have your live lecture, and then your reply post, and then your written assignment that's due on the 12th, which is Sunday, and then your quiz. And again, I've encouraged students to take the quiz at the end of the week. Some have taken me up on it and scored higher after you've gone through the material. I want to I was trying to click on quiz, not quiz. Sorry, I was trying to click on written assignment to open it up. Reminding you it's 2 to 3 pages. 2 to 3 pages means 2 to 3 pages. I've been kind of giving a few breaks. People get 1 3/4, but I'm not doing that anymore. And then also I remind you that repeating the facts don't satisfy the requirement. I'm more interested in your critical thinking. The way that I look at this is I look at your rubric and I see if you hit the issues. And I read these papers by way of issue spotting. That's something that I was taught in law school that my professors did. And so I apply it with my large volume of students to help me get through grading. And I look for the issues to make sure. I look for the citations and references to APA requirements. I check for Grammarly. But it's very important that you include critical thinking in your papers, because that's what I really want to help you to become good at. And then I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I don't know if it was in this class, but it was in one of my classes that a student used Wikipedia. Never use Wikipedia as a reference because it is not a credible source, and most of us professors will tell you that. Okay, so that's the assignments for this week. Let's go more in detail with them. Okay, let's go to Module 6. Oops, what happened? Our connection didn't load. Try it again. There we go. I don't know what's happening here. Some technology. That's one of the things when you're dealing with technology. You have these little bleeps. Okay, again, I'm not going to go over the facts, but the facts are presented, and you're going to make sure that you provide a 2 to 3 page document applying the facts to answer who is the responsible corporate officer, or what is, who is the responsible corporate officer, of course, but what is the responsible corporate officer doctrine? And then asking whether it applies to David or Debbie. I really look heavily upon this issue because it's one of the important points to determine, but you determine why that person is or is not liable, and some possible defenses under the FDCA, which you're going to hear me talk about in a minute, but you should know what that is when you do this assignment, okay? And then your discussion post for the Patriot Act, talking about Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which created a special court and so forth. However, after September 11th, 2001, the Patriot Act was passed following terrorist attacks in the United States. And we are all ever familiar with that incident that happened. It changed the way that security was instituted in this country, and it also gave birth to an organization that did not exist prior to then called Homeland Security, another one of the cabinet positions and agencies that specifically deal with terrorist activity. And then, so I'm going to ask you to deal with this question in your discussion post. And then please, when explaining your answer, define the impact on the Fourth Amendment. What do you think it is the impact on it? There is some impact, but then people present a position, and I have responded to one already, but I'll be responding to others about what the impact is and what takes place. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You'll be able to discover that yourself. Now, let's go to the module itself in terms of lesson. Here we go, the lesson content, before we get to the lecture. What the objectives are, again, we're going to deal with health and crime, health legislation, and public health crimes. And I again remind you of the reading and the sections that you're supposed to look at: offenses against public order and health, which we're going to look at in a second very briefly, and then your written assignment. Notice always that you have to conduct some research, and you cannot use your textbook as a sole source. I covered that in the open house. I cover that, try to, in every lecture, but I also remind you that it's on your course homepage, and it's also on the syllabus. A lot of students can probably fare better and gain more points in their grades by making sure they're reminded of using the rubric for each written assignment, as well as, and that applies to discussion posts too. There's a rubric I presented to you for that. And then also making sure that you read what the written assignment is requiring itself in the module, and make sure you have the proper number of pages and everything included in there. And then the other steps that I already mentioned, Grammarly, etc. Okay, so then these are the definitions for offenses against public order and health. Explains the purpose for public health. One of the articles that's critical in terms of how this is done is Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, called the Commerce Clause. And commerce, it just basically involves any activity that goes across state line in what we call interstate, which means it affects more than one state. And Congress passes laws to enact legislation when the activity is interstate. If it's intrastate, which means in the state, within the state, then the state deals with this. However, though, notice this, that the laws are produced by congressional acts, the federal government. However, it is the states that pretty much enforce most of them. There are some exceptions. The Patriot Act, for example, is enforced on a federal level, and you'll end up in federal court. And then most of the acts that we'll talk about. So now we FDCA, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, deals with food and drugs, and the FDCA prohibits these items here from being delivered into, as I said, interstate commerce that is adulterated or misbranded. And point 2, adulterating or misbranding any food in interstate commerce. And then the receipt in interstate commerce of any food, drug, or cosmetic that is adulterated or mishandled, and those are violations of the FDCA. Now, who enforces that? The states, but there's a state federal agency called the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that you should run across and understand about it. So then it tells you about strict liability, and then there's your answer to the question about responsible corporate officers, and you want to make sure that you do pay attention to this, because it affects your written assignment that I just discussed with you a few minutes ago. And then some recent developments, and then, of course, the Patriot Act. It talks about that. And I just can't believe that that phone is ringing. It never rings this time of night, but now it's ringing, of course. It stopped. Somebody answered in the other room. So anyway, and then do this puzzle. Do this puzzle. I'm not going to do it with you, but it tells you the answer to one across is a person who holds a supervisory position in an organization and may be subject to criminal liability. for regulatory offenses committed by subordinates. There's a clue given already in stuff that we have gone through already. So again, it's good to do these things, and then you do this one, criminal offenses dealing with public health, and then local laws, number 2, and that's down. And then number 3 is down. 4 is also down, and the rest of them are down all the way. And you get those, and the puzzle will help you. But type in the text box and click a clue. There's a clue that will pop up that will help you to get this done. And then score yourself. See, here's what you're doing. You're actually studying for the quiz by doing this. Trust me, it's a very important thing. Don't take it, oh yeah, that's just a little exercise. Our exercises are built in to help you to gather information in the module. And so that's it for what the assignments are for this week. I am going to now go back into the classroom. All right, and so now I'm going to go directly to our PowerPoints. If you have any questions, type your answers in or questions in the chat box. If you don't type anything in, don't worry about it. That means I know that you're all good. Okay, just make sure that you communicate with me. So Chapter 11, offenses against public health and the environment. You know, you got to understand something, as I'm able to go through this pretty fast, this chapter, because of the fact that the goal is to recognize that from a scientific, environmental level, that we only have so many resources that we have been given, such as air, water, our land, and we have to make sure that we protect the resources. Professor Wright, why did you say land? The reason I said land is because of the fact that we plant food. We have animals that eat the grass or the grain or whatever that comes from the planting. And if there are drugs or some kind of dangerous substance to our bodies, something that will hurt us, put into that soil, it will come up in the root of the plant. And who will ingest it is animals. And if the animals ingest it, we'll eat the animals and meat. Or if you're not a carnivorous person like I am, cows and chickens, they run from me, and turkeys, because I'm carnivorous. I love meat. So anyway, those of you who are not, who are vegans, or those of you who decide that you're going to just eat, vegetables and fruit and stuff like that, salads and all of that kind of stuff, that's cool, but more power to you. Then you will have the same problem, because those plants and vegetables and all those things grow in the ground, and then so the land has to be protected. The water, of course, because why? Well, we wash our clothes in the water. We wash our vehicles in the water. We drink the water, more importantly. Somebody says, yeah, but we drink more bottled water. Hello, somebody. I heard a person in Congress actually say that we don't have to worry as much about the water being contaminated anymore because we rely more on bottled water. And I said, does that person realize that water means water, and that water that you drink is actually processed water as well, even that spring water? One of the exceptions that I know of is that I was in Alaska, and I had some of the best water I ever had in my life, and that water actually comes from the mountains, the snow and the stuff, because air is pretty clean up there. And so as a result, that water would come down and they would filter it. All they did was filter it to get the rocks and whatever. And then you could drink that water straight from there. They didn't have any chemicals in it. And it was so cold. It was just really good water. But anyway, the point of the matter is that our water is important. Our fish live in that water, and we catch the fish, and we eat the water. So if that water is contaminated, it hurts us. And then we get to the air. The air is the same issue. We breathe. You already know that there are emission tests that most jurisdictions have. Most, I know we have here in Illinois, that require, because of the Clean Air Act, that require us to take our cars in to be tested and make sure that it passed the emissions test, because that's a movement towards keeping our air clean. And if you don't get that, you can't drive your car. Your license will be suspended, and if you drive that, then you'll get a ticket and pay a fine. And then also the things that back to water, what the plants dump into the water. Also back to the soil, we deal with land waste. You can remember that waste management is so important. We operate a lot on recyclables, encouraging that, but we also don't dispose of things like, we're not supposed to anyway, dispose of batteries. We're not supposed to dispose of TVs, computers, and those kinds of things without some special arrangements being set, because, again, to protect the soil and also the water as well. But back to the water issue, again, is you swim in the water, you do and listen to this, our world is made up primarily of water, and then your body is also primarily water. So it's very important that we protect those resources. So this helps me to move a little faster through this particular chapter. So we recognize back in what we call the Industrial Revolution that we need to protect our resources and good health. So we moved on in terms of dealing with the air, for example, and the land, with littering, noise ordinances, because noise ordinances can disturb the peace, but noise ordinances can also create issues, with the hearing of people. Everything is happening. Somebody's calling me. People don't usually call me during my lectures. Let me turn that off now. And then Congress itself and cities dealt with these laws that did that. But now, as I said, the municipalities and the counties and the states, the local government is pretty much dealing with it. And they have various regulatory agencies. I already talked about one, the FDA. You have the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and most states have some form of that as well. You have all kinds of agencies that are just around to make sure that our resources are protected. One of the things that really vex me and get on my nerves is, and we've all seen it, is people will take their bags of stuff and garbage, and some of them will even have them in a vehicle, and they will dump it on the side of the road. That's just ridiculous, because it creates a hazard to the land, and also, excuse me, it puts them in a situation where it's just litter. It's litter, and it's a violation of the law. And most of the laws that fit within the category of this chapter are strict liability laws, and strict liability laws are very simple. We've kind of talked about them earlier, but strict liability laws involve situations where all that has to be proved is that you violated the law. Doesn't matter whether you knew the law existed or not. We discussed that in I think a couple modules ago when the person didn't have their had their driver's license suspended and didn't know, and those kinds of things. We had that in a discussion post. But strict liability laws apply there. Okay, and so the laws are what we call mala prohibited, which means that on its face, if you violate it, you will end up with either a serious fine or either a misdemeanor. And so I don't have to go into the details of these right here, except to mention in this case of 1980 case, we already know it's common sense based on something I just said to criminal offense to dispose of garbage in a ditch, pond, or stream. There are people that do that, and for obvious reasons that I've already covered. That's why that law is there and says if you do that, you're going to pay a penalty for that. The F, Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, we already kind of talked about that, what it does and what it's supposed to do, so I'm not going to continue detailing that. Here's a cool one. I always like this. This is one of my favorite PowerPoints in this particular chapter. And a lot of you guys are too young to know about this. The motto of things go better with Coke was a cute phrase, and the reason why is because of what happened with Coca-Cola. It says there was an attempt to outlaw Coca-Cola because it actually, listen, it is not a mistake. It was actually made with and had one of the ingredients, cocaine. That's, people said, whoa, bring that back. I said, no, we don't need to bring that back. But the fact of the matter is think about that. People were drinking a cocaine substance legally. So then Coca-Cola got the heat from the federal government, and they said, no, that's not correct. So what the federal government got them to do was compromise, and they came up with caffeine. But the Supreme Court said, hold it, we got to limit that because they just went caffeine crazy. I mean, it would be, there's a cola we used to drink. I didn't much, but one of my friends did when we were, most of my friends, or quite a few when I was in law school, called Jolt, J-O-L-T, cola. And it had a lightning bolt on it. Well, you drink this to keep you up. There's another drink, too, I can't think of. Well, that's what people use Red Bull for. And one of the other drinks that does that because of the excessive amount of caffeine is Mountain Dew, which leads to the reason why people see the commercial, Yahoo Mountain Dew. It will make you say Yahoo because of the excessive amount of cocaine. But anyway, the fact of the matter is the government is not good for you. And we already know caffeine's not good for you. And, you know, you find it in coffee. So now what did they do? They came in with decaffeinated and all of that kind of stuff. So what they do, they put something else in it that now they're finding out that's bad for you. So anyway, Coca-Cola did reduce the caffeine to satisfy the government. So I'm not going to go through and ask this question, but I will say this. This last point, drinks like Monster and Red Bull, you know what? I don't drink those things. I don't take those things into my body because what they do is they increase your heart rate. And a lot of people don't know that, and that's not a good thing. People, well, increasing your heart rate because of exercise is one thing, but when you put a substance in that is to stimulate your body and make it do more than it's supposed to, then you got a problem. That's why a lot of people that I know, they got to have their coffee. And it's a pick-me-up, that kind of thing. But I don't like to have foreign substances. Give me some water. Just give me some water, okay? Moving right along here. We already talked about what strict liability is, and no intent or mens rea is necessary. In order to prove strict liability and have it as a felony, there must be a specific intent. That means the person must just totally ignore the fact that it's going to create a damage to a person or animals or so forth, or to our environment. And some people say that strict liability crimes shouldn't be because you become a criminal without violating morality. Here's the deal, people. The law is here for us to follow. We are obligated to follow the law, or else we'd have chaos. So somebody said, well, it's not technically criminal. Yeah, it is, because if the statute says it's criminal, it's criminal. And so that means you don't do it, period. That's it. And so as a result, when people come about and says, oh, there are not really these bad things, and then some of these things are just affecting ourselves, well, the point of the matter is that the people who are held responsible for that, and I'm kind of giving you a little bit of information, are the corporate producers of these things, and then there's certain parts of that that cause that to happen, but we'll get into that in a minute. The point of the matter is that it should be strict liability. Then there's zoning ordinances. This has to do primarily with putting certain kinds of buildings in certain areas, and almost every locality, city, municipality, and some counties have zoning boards that enforce the zoning so that certain type of buildings or properties can't be used for certain uses. And it's all based on protecting the public from the possibility of injury in those properties, and also protecting our environment as well. And they usually are civil matters. Generally, they are civil matters. For example, if you build something and it actually violates the zoning ordinance, it won't be able to be approved by the agency that has to approve it. The building commission or whoever, or the building inspector or the code enforcement team, whoever, they won't approve it. And you end up getting torn down at your expense. And those kind of things. So, and you can't just take a building and occupy it and do anything that the building wasn't zoned for use, with the exception of going through what we call special use hearings, and I'm not going to elaborate on that. But anyway, zoning ordinances are there. These are also to protect the land environment as well. The Commerce Clause, already I talked about that. Article 1, Section 8 allows the Congress to enact the laws, and then I already said that most states have agencies such as we call it the little EPA. The Environmental Protection Agency is a federal agency, but Illinois has one, and most states I know have one as well. The Rivers and Harbors Act, going back to 1899, established that it was a misdemeanor to discharge refuse or stuff into any navigable waters. Once again, why navigable? Because it would go across state lines and affect the borders of more than the jurisdiction where it is released. The United States held that the government can prosecute those who discharge navigable, trash or whatever into navigable waters, and this case came to the conclusion that this company was convicted of discharging iron and concrete pipes because of what it would do to the water. And it says without a permit. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. Why are they doing it any? Well, excuse me, a permit might allow them to do a certain percentage of it, but if they go beyond that, then that's when they get into a problem. I would say this, that you're going to discover when you're dealing with these is that there's not an absolute bar for most things in the water, but that the percentage of things. Now, for example, you're really not supposed to, and I've seen people do it, they take old medicines and drugs and things like that, and they'll flush them down the toilet. Technically, that's wrong, but there's no way to police it. But you should be aware of the fact that those things eventually end up in the water. And again, for the reasons I discussed earlier about the importance of clean water for us in our survival. The Clean Air Act, I've already kind of talked about that, and you can be held responsible for falsifying documents, dealing with things like, for example, with vehicles, there's odometer tampering, which and the reason for that is because it tells how long that car has been in operation, or that vehicle's been in operation, and that it's a misrepresentation to a buyer, so that they will know how close to maybe violating the Clean Air Act it might become, because the older a car gets, you end up having to replace things like mufflers for the noise. You have to take care of other parts of the car, such as, and I'm drawing a blank on it, my mechanic told me something I had to replace in my car to get my check engine light off, and I can't recall what it is because I'm not a mechanic, but most of us know that those things. But anyway, those are there for clean air. Also, something you should be aware of, that years ago when I was a kid, that we were allowed, or we weren't, but our parents were allowed to go to the gas station, and they would get gasoline that that wasn't the kind that we had here. They had what they call regular, and it had a lot of lead. Now all gasoline has to be unleaded by law because of the emission issues that we recognize that will come out of vehicles. Have you ever been driving behind a vehicle, and you're driving behind it, and it's not your car, but you have to get from behind it because there's some fumes coming through from that car that get into your vehicle or that vehicle in front of you, and they will make you sick. They will even make you lightheaded and those kind of things. So those are the kinds of things that we were talking about. Clean Water Act, I won't go over that because we've already kind of covered that. Dealing with oil spills, BP, this is a famous case where they were held responsible for an oil spill that killed 11 men and injured 17 others. And then the spill, the effect after that, there was an explosion that took place that killed these people. But the spill that came about affected marine and wildlife and destroyed the beaches, things that we talked about a few minutes ago, and they were fined $4.5 million in fines. And so that's nothing, I guess somebody says, for them to do that. Well, what they did was, because of the fact that they were negligent in it, they were held responsible for the damage that took place. However, if you continue to allow those kind of things, then you're, again, going to take the resources away that we can drink and use in terms of the water. And so the consequences of the oil spill could further also be, if it was proved that they could have prevented it, the corporate officers might be affected by that as well. But the bottom line is that there's a penalty that's paid for doing things like that. The Resource and Conservation Recovery Act is also in there for that reason, to protect against disposing of hazardous waste. There are fines and prison for high levels. And the states themselves, as I already said, set the standards. And some of the illegal actions of this statute in transporting hazardous waste to unpermitted facilities. You've been behind vehicles and you've seen that it says non-potable drinking water, not drinking water. You can't drink it, but they use it for certain things, but you can't drink that water. Storing and disposing of hazardous waste without a permit omitting material information or making false statements or reports also violates that. Again, once again, it goes back to the foundation of what I talked about earlier. The Toxic Substance Control Act prohibits the manufacture, distribution, and use of chemicals that present unreasonable risk to the environment, because what happens is they either go into the air or in the water or in the ground. And most of the time it's a civil, but criminal prosecution is possible depending on the extent and level that it takes place. Now we get to something that if you were like, okay, now it's time to really pucker up, because this goes to your written assignment. Criminal liability of corporations. Food, drugs, and cosmetics are usually produced by corporations. Corporations you should be aware of. This is not a business law class, but I will just say this to you. A corporation is an entity that is a person in itself under the law. And there is a dual purpose for it, tax benefit, but one of the benefits is to protect the individuals from liability. However, there is very serious criminal liability that if you are an officer of a corporation, or either a board member of the board of directors, which is an officer, or president, or secretary, or treasurer, you could be held accountable if you don't properly supervise production and distribution. Wait, these people are in the boardroom, they're in the offices. Well, yeah, but they can monitor, and failure to monitor can result in them becoming criminally liable because of the potential death or serious injury that could come to the public, such as misbranding food. They know what they're doing, and they're not following through with the mechanisms. The Parks case is an example where Parks had failed to use his authority to operate the company to prevent food storage in contaminated places. I have actually found out from inspectors that I know, the food inspectors, some really bad things about some restaurants. They said they have gone in and they have seen food that you eat, like for example on a buffet, and they have found that they go back and see that it's not refrigerated. It's actually sitting in the back, and sometimes it sits out too long and bacteria gets into that food, and even with cooking it still doesn't help. And that's why, you know, there are people who I like my steak medium well. There are people who like their steaks hardly, they're not well at all, and it's real, the cow's still fighting for their lives, as we say. The point of the matter is that the companies that allow this to happen, food poisoning, E. coli, and all of these different things are found in salad bars and things like that. You know, you probably won't go to a buffet after listening to this. But anyway, the point of the matter is that there is some liability that the corporation heads have in terms of that, and can result in jail time. Here's an example here. The Supreme Court said that the corporate officers since 1943, here's a case for you, Wright, can be held criminally liable for acts of the corporation. The corporation had purchased drugs from other manufacturers and so forth, and put their own labels on it. Well, this was misbranding because it misled the public. And so the Supreme Court upheld the conviction, arguing that he was in a responsible position to prevent public danger. So, in other words, it goes back to what I just said. If you're in a responsible position, you better do your job well, or either get away from that position. Noise pollution, quiet communities, and making sure that there's not loud music. It's commonly quite clear that police will stop you if you're playing your music too loud and those kind of things. But the reason for that is to protect the hearing of many people, but it also is there to protect the fact that the public they don't want to be, I'm laying in my bed at night, then I hear something, bam, 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 wakes me up. It's from something that's happening outside noise-wise. I used to live, when I was a kid, near a factory, and we were in a residential community, but the factory was close enough and it was forging steel. And when I say forging it had heat, and it had these hammers that go bam, bam. Well, they used to allow them to do that so late into the night that people complained. Well, the law changed, and eventually they had to change the times that they did that. We got right outside where I'm at right now, there's some construction going on across the street. They're building something, and they can only do it during certain hours. They can't do it too early in the morning, and they can't do it too late at night. Okay. So anyway, the ordinances that are on the books, though, have to be clear and let the person know specifically what they're doing to violate it. Now, there's devices they use for measuring the decibels and levels of sound to make sure that person is not. Okay. Smoking laws. Many jurisdictions now don't allow smoking in public places, airplanes, buses, schools, even the electronic cigarettes. You go into Walmart, at least here, you'll see on the door that even electronic smoking is not good and not allowed. And many jurisdictions, including Illinois, move to eliminate that in restaurants. I remember back in the day, and it used to be a joke to me that they had a non-smoking section, and so I would always ask you, want smoking or non-smoking? So if you weren't a smoker, you wanted to sit in the non-smoking section. Well, those who sat in the smoking section, their smoke would come over to the side for the non-smokers. So it was like a mockery. So finally, the law says, wait a minute, this is not working very well. And then also, it went even further. Public places was extended to nightclubs, discos, and casinos and all of that. Now, I got a shock when I went to Vegas. And, I'm not a gambler, but my wife and I went to Vegas, and we were at a really nice hotel. And, in fact, there's a stratosphere. Like a space needle is shaped like. And so anyway, on the ground level, you go through the casino, and people are sitting there, and they don't have a smoking ban in the casinos. And I was like, oh no, this is not cool. So even walking through the place, when we get into our non-smoking room, our clothes, you could smell it even in the clothing. Anyway, it's bad because it's been clearly established under medical science that secondhand smoke is really worse than the person who's smoking. And so as a result, this goes to why there are anti-smoking laws and so forth. And the punishment is usually fines and things like that. So Florida initiative, it talks about enacted laws prohibiting smoking in restaurants and other public places that I just got through talking about. Some exceptions for standalone bars, and the punishment is generally a fine. And these are some initiatives regarding smoking laws, which I won't go into. And then we have to protect our wildlife. Coming up for years, it's been clear that if you go fishing, you have to have a fishing license. And the reason for that is because it puts you at a stage where you can only catch so many fish because the ecological balance had to be maintained for fish and other wildlife. Same thing with hunting, those people who are hunters. And so the law is there to protect the wildlife because it balances our ecological existence. Migration Bird Act protects certain species of birds that migrate from hunting. You can't hunt them, and it's usually a misdemeanor, but it's a felony to take the bird and then for sale, to sell it. Now, be aware that one of the birds is protected on the federal level, and everybody should know this. You cannot, under any circumstances, kill a bald eagle. Have you ever, and that's a federal law, have you ever been driving along and you've seen ducks or geese cross the road? I'm sure you've seen that. But do you know that what will happen if you run over them? You'll get a ticket. You'll get fined because of these kinds of things. And there are even signs on the road that warn you, and they come across. And I can't tell you how many times I've been on my way someplace that those birds, they come across the road, and you have to let them go. Let them walk across the place. You can't run over them, those kind of things. Now, deer. We're talking about wildlife. Deer cross the road, and the same thing. If you hit them, they'll pop out there something and you hit them. Well, I've seen people, they hit them. Of course, it tears your vehicle up pretty much, but I've seen people hit them and then they grab them. I've seen this and throw them in their vehicle. Not usually a car. It's usually a pickup, and they'll take them. But anyway, the point of the matter is that here's the deal. The bottom line is wildlife is protected because it's an environmental issue as well. Endangered species, I already talked about the ecosystems, preserving wildlife, fish, and plants. There are penalties that take place against any person who knowingly violates regulations under that act. So, all righty. And so then you can use the example of nesting sea turtles. Again, we're dealing with the ecosystems and protecting them as well. If we didn't have these laws in place, they would be extinct or become extinct. Such as whale hunting, endangered. Whales were hunted excessively because of the oil up in Alaska and in the North Pole, used for food, clothing, and other products. And then when technology came about, it enhanced the ability to catch them and kill them. So there had to be some very serious advancements that took place. Obviously in 1946, we didn't have those, but they began to recognize that there need to be some regulation, okay? And that's it for this chapter. We've got about a half an hour to go, so I'm going to go ahead and again, if you have any questions about anything in this chapter that I didn't cover, just type it in and I will address it. So now we deal with the second chapter, offenses against public order, safety, and national security. You should be aware of the fact, I don't have to tell you, we're in a terroristic society. I don't have to tell you. Almost every day now, we're getting activities of terrorism or extreme violence. Vegas. I mean, we're going back years talking about Sandy Hook, Columbine, those kind of situations. I remember in '84, I was in California in San Diego, and I could have been in one, but I left the restaurant before this guy came in and killed large numbers of people with big caches of weapons. And then now, most recently here, the one that took place in church. It's getting to be a scary thing, people, that you can't even go to church anymore. And I'm a pastor of a church, and somebody says, "Are you guys going to get guns?" I said, "Nope, we're not going to get guns, because there's a whole issue about discussing guns, which I won't go into today. But the fact of the matter is that we have a dilemma. We have a serious issue. There are things happening in our country. Forget about the other countries, but I mean, when I say forget, I mean I'm not dealing with them. I'm dealing with what's happening to our own public here. There's violence all over the place. There's violence in the name of governments, like ISIS and other foreign agencies. But again, there are terrorists that take place on a domestic level where they're neither involved in any of those kinds of things. They're just committing mass destruction using semi-automatic or automatic weapons. Again, I'm not going to get into that, but I will say this. We need to pass laws to ban those weapons. We need to, because law enforcement is in danger and the public is in danger from those situations. They're not used for hunting. They're just used for killing. And only the military should have those to utilize during wars or battles or missions that they're involved in. So that's my spiel on that before I get into the chapter. Okay. So who has to protect us? The government on a federal level, a state level, a county level, and a municipal level. And there are law enforcement officers on all levels. There's the federal level, you got the FBI, you got the CIA, you've got Homeland Security. On the state level, you've got the state police and other types of agencies like that. And then on the county, you've got the county police as well. And then locally, you have law enforcement or police officers in terms of protecting you in cities and municipalities. But the government has laws to protect us and keep our country safe for people. Again, with the issue of what's happening in this country, dealing with the protection of this nation, the military forces and some of the agencies I mentioned, the FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, etc. There are criminal laws on the books to protect us. It's a scary time, again, people. I remember when I used to go, and still do, go to games and things like that. There is a large, tremendous number of metal detectors that you have to go through before you enter. And backpacks. I went to a Bears game, and they took the backpacks, and they didn't allow us to bring in certain things, even most innocent of things now because of what's happening. So anyway, so the government is passing laws to protect us, I'll elaborate on that in a few minutes when I get to a few of these. But I want you to keep that in mind. Now, under common law, before statutes and all of that, the crimes against public order were there, like breaches of the peace, inciting a riot, disorderly conduct, and violation of noise ordinances. And normally, those were minor. We still now have ordinances and statutes that protect in those situations. It said, if 3 or more persons met together with the intention of cooperating to disturb the public peace, it was considered an unlawful assembly and under common law. But we've had some clashes with First Amendment issues. But still, again, getting back to the protection of the public, there is a determination as to, is this gathering intended to disturb the peace? Not necessarily just the sound or the noise, but to create violence or to get people all fired up and excited to commit violent acts. Then it violates the law because, again, getting back to the safety of the public. So if people took steps to execute their plans, then it was a rout. If they executed their plans, then it became a riot. Once again, under common law. And we have transferred that over into statutes, some of which I won't mention now. The federal government, the state, and the local, as I said, already all deal with that. The ordinances, disorderly conduct. And then oftentimes, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are conflicts between keeping the peace and the First Amendment, such as the right of speech and assembly. But the point of the matter is that under the law, people always, oh, I have my right to assemble. It can be restricted where it's necessary to achieve a compelling public interest. What is a compelling public interest? If your activities or the way that you're doing your activities could result in a probable breach of peace, then we have some violations, such as the thing that happened that resulted in, I think it was in North Carolina or South Carolina, with the demonstrations that took place. But there were more than demonstrations. There were other things, and they were insightful and resulted in people being injured. There's nothing wrong with people demonstrating or protesting peacefully, as we will cover. But the point of the matter is that if there is some violent intent or you're doing it to incite, then the First Amendment says no, because it's not a peaceful assembly. Oops, go back. Okay, here's a case in '83, the United States Supreme Court dealt with, that said that the First Amendment rights to free speech cannot be restricted on the sidewalk in front of the Supreme Court. So this woman had been told by police that according to a statute, 40 United States Code, that she could not hold up her sign displaying the text of the First Amendment on the sidewalk. Well, that doesn't make sense, because now you're reaching to a situation where there's no violence involved. The person is merely advertising their sign. The court said, rightfully so, that the statute is unconstitutional because it restricts individuals from peaceful assembly, and also because it was in front of the Supreme Court that they could not restrict it. I will tell you that was 1983. It's interesting, in 1977, I, as a student in law school, was part of a Black American Law Student Association, the national organization, and I participated in a march because there was a case coming up in the United States Supreme Court that we didn't agree with, and we marched. And we had a rally after that on the stairs of the Capitol. And we had nobody bothered us. And we had Congress people marching with us. And the bottom line was we were exercising our constitutional right. We had gotten the necessary permits to march. And the reason for the permits is to restrict the hours so that you're not doing it in unreasonable hours. We did it while the court was open, and the court was actually in session. We weren't blocking people from going in and out, but we did do that. And so here we come to '83. We didn't have signs at that time, or I think we might have even. I don't remember. The bottom line was nobody messed with us law students. So, but in '83, this woman was messed with by this police officer, and anyway, that caused, and that law was probably on the books then, but it didn't affect us. If it would have been before 1983, there would have been a case that involved. It could have been United States versus Wright, but it wasn't. So anyway, the fact of the matter is that the bottom line is that people have a right to do that. The the Federal Anti-Riot Act says that if you travel across state lines or use the mail, telegraph, radio, television Now I'll add internet, texting, and social media with intent to incite, encourage, participate in, or carry on a riot, or to aid or abet any person in inciting in a riot, you will violate the Federal Anti-Riot Act. And this act has been challenged. In 1972, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit held that the Anti-Riot Act is not unconstitutionally vague or overbroad. I remember why that case came about. There were people called the weathermen. They were not like the people who report weather. They were a radical agency, a group of people, and they advocated violence, but they marched and they were in a situation where they were inciting people. And so they were arrested, and the case started in the district court in Chicago, and then the Seventh Circuit, which is actually home-based in Chicago, heard the case, and they decided that no, these people actually came across state lines and traveled all over the country, from all over the country, to come together for this situation that resulted in riots. There was actually a person who he was a sheriff of Cook County, Richard Elrod. He tackled somebody and he became disabled as a result of that. And so there were a whole lot of issues, and I remember that extremely well. It was just while I was in college. I was always downtown because I worked down there and went to school down there. And so anyway, that's what that Anti-Riot Act is all about. Makes sense? Now, here's an attempt, Edwards versus South Carolina, where the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do this. Students, African-American students, had been singing and having speeches, and the police told them to stop, and they didn't stop. So the court said, so they were arrested. So the court argued that the students were peacefully expressing their opinion, and says that the state, because of the 14th Amendment, which applies our Bill of Rights to the states, the First Amendment in that situation, it reached a stage where the 14th Amendment does not permit the state to make criminal the peaceful expression of unpopular views. So those views were not popular in South Carolina, but the United States Supreme Court says it was peaceful assembly and not a violation of the Constitution. Occupy Wall Street is another example. Now here we get into the point of, remember, the compelling interest that I talked about. Started in September 2011. Remember, this was post-2001, in which we had the Patriot Act. Anywhere there were protests, social and economic inequality concerning the influence of financial and other corporate governments. The protesters gathered in a park located in near the Wall Street area in New York. The police forced them out of the park, and the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, were monitoring as they did after September 11th, and looked at Occupy Wall Street as a terrorist threat. You got to remember where it took place in the Mecca there. It was because of what happened September 11th, 2001. They always heavily monitor that. And so the police, in order to keep order, they put up barricades, and the protesters pushed them back. Once you do that, then that's when chaos happens. So the question is, were they breaching the peace, or did the police overreact? That was a debate. There were some cases that came out of that actually demonstrated that the individuals were not just peacefully demonstrating, but they took it to the level beyond that, and violence erupted. Vagrancy laws came about where started in England, where a person who didn't have any support, visible support, not employed or working, and not able to work, but not deciding they want to work. So they were vagrants. They just, so in 1800, American states started putting out definitions of vagrancy. By the 1950s, the laws began to affect alcoholics and what we call derelicts, or vagrants, the same thing. But in 1972, though, the Supreme Court ruled the statutes were vague because they were using criteria that didn't put on notice the person, and that it was also reaching the possibility of where some people were being arrested and prosecuted based on status. And so anyway, for many years, most states continued their battles to eliminate the homeless. And it's kind of like a sad statement for the United States to be making, instead of helping people to get homes and stuff like that, that most people I know that become homeless, they don't do it on purpose. And many people don't become alcoholics on purpose. It's an illness and something that has to be dealt with. So anyway, the vagrancy laws were there. And so what happened is that there were cases that went to the Supreme Court, like in 1972, when the city of Jacksonville had a vagrancy statute, and it was very vague and led to arbitrary arrest. And this person had been convicted for violating that ordinance. So if the law is too vague and it's not provide enough information for a person to know that they really violated it, then in that case it was considered to be unconstitutional. After the Papa Christou case, the states began to change their laws to make them more narrow, to focus on preventing crimes such as prostitution and things like that. So the loitering, also some cities and states enacted their own ordinances, and most of them were held unconstitutionally vague because the purpose of the laws were to minimize the gatherings, but the purpose for that, like many jurisdictions were trying to fight gangs from hanging out and stuff like that, and laws were not vague, were vague rather. And so loitering laws, as it says, must focus on conduct and not status. That's what I was saying earlier, that the end result that happened with a lot of those laws. Homeless people in Florida, even today as I speak, it is a violation of the law to overnight in public places. In Chicago, we have areas where people stay under bridges and even under our downtown area. There's what we call Lower Wacker. There are people, but they get moved. But the point of the matter is these are homeless people, and they're not prosecuted, but they do keep trying to move those people along. So anyway, the issue of loitering. The key thing that you need to be aware of is that the law shouldn't be punitive for individuals who hit on hard times, but it should be a law that affects and attempt to minimize violence. But even those can fall, as in this one right here, that in 1999, the city of Chicago, which has had a gang problem for a long time, this case, and I remember this really well because it was almost near the time I was ready to retire, this involved some gangs in Chicago. And so what happened is Chicago enacted an ordinance which said that police officers could arrest anyone who they reasonably believed to be gang members who were loitering in a public place. Now what they were doing was they were going on the status of those individuals, not that they were doing anything. So the court said that that ordinance was unconstitutional because it did not specify what behaviors that they had to do. Not just hanging out, being a gang. They weren't doing anything, and if they were, then whatever they were doing could be the charges. But this statute was taken away. But the purpose for this statute was to try to fight gangs, and it fell because the First Amendment right of congregation or peaceful assembly or gathering could not be violated in favor of fighting crime. Okay. Get back to panhandling. Panhandling, before Papa Christou, vagrancy laws regularly include ordinance against begging. But after that, the court invalidated these laws, as I said, and cities began to change them specifically with ordinance saying begging or panhandling. And what they began to say is that it was a nuisance to the public, and so therefore it became a basis for laws. And so these laws are still open now. That's why down in Florida, I told you there was one. Eventually, it's going to end up going to the Supreme Court. Now, you be aware of the fact that depending on the makeup of the Supreme Court will determine whether or not there's a constitutional protection given. And the court is moving more to the right, and that individual rights could be adversely affected. I said could be. So the state courts have typically struck down these ordinances, but they haven't reached the point where it's been a unified issue where it ends up before the United States Supreme Court. It's going to happen one day. Motor vehicle violations are strict liability offenses, speeding, so forth and so on. The most traffic laws have them so that if you violated the law, you were fined, given a ticket, or maybe even jailed, depending on the seriousness of the offense. So, but misdemeanors prior to the 1960s, in the 60s, offenses were not crime, but a civil infraction, so you'd end up in traffic court. Now we get into this whole issue about gun control. Again, I already talked about the situation, and we're aware of what just happened the other day, what happened a few weeks ago, and it just goes on and on. More than 300,000 violent crimes were committed in 2008, and the numbers are up now. And the Second Amendment debate continues. The right to bear firearms issue, people who are mentally ill, who have a felony, it says are excluded from this right. Not anymore. Not anymore, especially mentally ill. The President of the United States has decided to allow that mentally ill individuals to exercise what the courts have interpreted as the right to bear firearms. That doesn't make any sense. Look at what happened the other day, and you'll understand the position. So, again, it's an issue that that troubles me and troubles more and more people as time comes on. Now, a lot of the legislators are moving forward. But here's the issue, and I said this. I did a whole lecture on the Second Amendment in the constitutional law class that I teach during not last week, but week before last, that involved the no, it was last week I did it. It was last week because I didn't do one in week 2, so it was week 4 I did it, and not last week, but in week 4 I did it. Well, what happened? I mean, week 5 rather, I did it instead of doing it in week 4. Well, the whole issue comes to the strength of the federal, I mean not the federal, what the NRA, National Rifle Association, which I already have said, and I state this over and over, that they're a conduit of the manufacturers of firearms. Because if they're very strong in terms of lobbying, and as a result, um, we still have laws that need to be fixed to deal with this issue. So anyway, but as it stands now, is the way it is, as I stated. Mentally ill persons are allowed to possess these weapons. So now why don't we just give car keys to minors? You know, I'm saying that in jest, but anyway, the state and federal government have the right to impose gun regulation laws, background checks, concealed weapon. Illinois was the last state in the union to allow carry conceal, and so we have that. Okay, we got 5 more minutes here. And so then there's some examples. Sandy Hook. I don't even have to use Sandy Hook right now. I can use what just happened Sunday at the church in Texas. National security, we're dealing with treason, the making of war against one's own government or giving aid and comfort to its enemies. No one's been convicted of treason since World War II. Usually it happens during wars. Vietnam and those other wars didn't fit within that category. Espionage is the crime of turning over state secrets to foreign government. We had Edward Snowden, who they did a movie about, involved with that. And then there been a couple other instances. There was one that happened with another, I think it was a naval officer out in California. Anyway, that can result in some very serious penalties, life sentences, and sometimes even death. And so the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1982, which deals with protecting government secrets and things of that nature. Sabotage, the making of or infiltrating and destroying a nation's war-making capabilities with sabotage during war or a national emergency. 30-year mandatory prison sentence. That goes to what I was talking about a few minutes ago. Sedition is the crime of advocating or working toward the violent overthrow of someone's own government. We don't deal with that a whole lot now, but because of the next thing that I'm going to talk about, we deal with it from that perspective. Dealing with terrorism. And because now it's a whole new ball game after September 11th, where terror has reached the United States soil. Prior to September 11th, there were some instances such as Oklahoma City and some other ones that were smaller. But the most major act of terrorism existed, which started a war, happened in Pearl Harbor in 1941. But after that, we didn't have a lot of that. But by 1996, Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act came about. That was after the Oklahoma City bombing, and it enacted federal jurisdiction with respect to investigation and prosecution of international terrorism. Now we're dealing with domestic terrorism as well, as was the Oklahoma City bombing. It wasn't an international activity. There were 2 people. One was actually executed, and one is now serving a life sentence for that. So we're in a whole nother vein. And so now we come to the thing that affects us at the present time. The United States has enacted the Patriot Act, following, as I said, the September 11th, which prohibits for terrorist organizations inside and outside the United States. That's why we deal with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other organizations. That's why we deal with people like Osama bin Laden and other terrorists. We deal also with, on the federal level in our jurisdiction, racketeering and fraud in connection with cyber crimes, because with the advent of computers, we now have individuals who commit crimes by utilizing the World Wide Web. And then biological weapons. These are weapons of mass destruction. I'm not necessarily talking about automatic or semi-automatic weapons, but I'm talking about chemicals to pollute our air and water primarily. And so in these instances under the Patriot Act, civil forfeitures, and then there are special rules about search warrants and things of that nature. Now, the debate that goes on involves, with the Patriot Act, is the Fourth Amendment, because there are some relaxing in terms of the search and seizure issues that take place regarding warrants for purposes of dealing with terrorist activity. And so there's a debate that's going on now as to whether or not we have given up our Fourth Amendment rights to a point and allowing the Patriot Act to include getting search warrants without satisfying all the necessary requirements of the U.S. Constitution. Well, the argument is continues and will continue based on the issue of the only people that are in are terrorists, not the average individual. Those who are proponents of terrorism, who actually take steps to do so, are subject to that. So the average person, the average criminal, I should say, is not subjected to that. But when it gets to the level that it affects the possibility of some terrorist activities, like what happened in that church, like what happened in Vegas, like what happened out in California earlier in the year or last year. I lose track of the time, but you know what I'm talking about. And then there are instances that took place like down in Orlando, and it just goes on and on and on. It's a scary thing, the Oklahoma City bombing, but then also the Boston Marathon, what happened there in that situation. But anyway, so there's a whole thing that's taking place, and we will continue to deal with that. You'll be dealing with that through your discussion posts. Aircraft piracy, wrongly seizing control of an aircraft by force, the threat of violence, naval piracy, robberies at sea, and so forth. It's over 10, so I'm about done here. Skip that. Weapons of mass destruction, I do want to take a minute to talk about that. To kill large numbers of people, and it includes, like I said, the biological, the nuclear, radiological, biological, and chemical weapons. Or the threat of using these weapons. Anthrax, we had a scare some years ago where white powder is looked at as being sent in the mail to government officials. Johnny Wise and Jack Abbott Grebe were convicted for threatening to use the biological weapons, sending emails to government agencies, like that was what I was talking about a minute ago. Immigration is an issue which is overused here, and so there's a debate that's taking place. They're trying to fix immigration, but unfortunately, immigration issues are being mixed up with terroristic activities, and it creates a problem with individuals who are trying to come to this country to live in a country that opens its arm to immigrants at the Statue of Liberty. That's what that's all about. But Congress has to work on that. Unfortunately, the immigration laws have adversely affected coming over the southern border. Only one group of people that I know that's aimed at. And everybody knows what I'm talking about without me even saying it. But the fact of the matter is that we have a problem now, and it's gotten to the point that ethnicity is dealt with and interweave immigration with terrorism. I've seen postings on Facebook that people remind everybody that this is what a terrorist looked like, and they're talking about the guy in Vegas, and they were talking about the guy that in Texas, and saying these people were not any of those people that came across the southern border or any of these countries that the bans that the president keeps seeking to impose to adversely affected. And so anyway, there's a debate about that, and so it continues. Well, that's all I have for tonight. It's 10:05, and so I'm going to say um, uh, get back to the classroom, and I'm going to say good night to each of you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me with any issues or concerns. Good night.